North America married cutting-edge science with public policy. We mandated the fortification of flour. We said, let's add, if people need niacin, let's add niacin. They also said, let's add these other B vitamins, riboflavin and thiamine. They also said, let's throw in some iron for good measure. It started with, I think it was white bread, but then it slowly expanded to things like pasta. And now it's in pretty much any flour product, even in corn flour. It's all enriched. Enriched is when it's enrichment and fortification are the same thing. They call it enrichment when the government says you got to do it. What's so funny is Italy didn't do that. The approach that Italy took, it's like they were still stuck in the Dark Ages. They said things like, well, poor people should raise rabbits because rabbits are, an economical form of meat, and we should have communal bread ovens, and maybe people with pellagra should drink wine. And you just think, like, are you guys idiots? Funnily enough, it actually wasn't bad advice because back then the wines weren't very well filtered. They had all sorts of yeast in them, and yeast is an amazing source of niacin. What's even more interesting is that it actually worked. Didn't work as quickly, but Italy literally ate its way out of a nutritional deficiency.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. You just heard from Mark Schatzker, author of the popular 2016 book, The Dorito Effect, as well as another international bestseller called The End of Craving, Recovering the Art of Eating. And that was released in 2021. So Mark visited Real Organic Project co-director Dave Chapman at his farm in Vermont not long ago, where they had a deep conversation about where food, flavor, nutrition, and the law intersect, and how that junction has shaped the health of citizens around the world.
I'm talking today with Mark Schatzker. Mark, welcome. Welcome to my home. Welcome to this podcast.
Nice to do it in person.
It is great. We've done several of these, always virtually. First an interview and then the book club. And I appreciate all of them. I will say for our audience that I think that you are one of the really important teachers of our time about food and about the food we eat, what's wrong, what's right, and we'll see about where to go from here. So,
well, thanks.
You've got 3 books. I'll hold them up. I don't always do this, but there are 3 important books: The End of Craving, Steak, and The Dorito Effect. And all 3 books, it's a trilogy, really. You started with Steak, and then The Dorito Effect, and then The End of Craving. Let's just briefly introduce people to these and what your evolution was as you researched them and wrote them.
Yeah, Steak was really, it began and was a travel adventure book, kind of in the Bill Bryson sense of a travel book. The subtitle is One Man's Search for the World's Tastiest Piece of Beef. And that's what it was. I traveled the world looking for the greatest steak. But the book started to ask some deeper questions. It had to. Did we evolve to eat meat? Why does meat taste the way it does? Where does flavor come from? Why do we like what we like? Really interesting questions like, how do cows know what to eat? Because cows don't read Men's Health or they don't go to nutrition class, and yet how do they nourish themselves? That's when I started to have some really interesting experiences. I'd visit a farm or a ranch, and they'd say, these mama cows are over in this field, they're eating clover because they need the protein because they're supporting a fetus. And these steers are over in this field and they're laying on fats, they're eating ryegrass. And you think, well, how do they know? I got very interested in flavor. The lesson of Steak was that the whole world is eating an awful lot of mediocre beef. We've gotten very good at producing a lot of beef, and it's come at a cost, and that is its flavor. Beef looks red, it just doesn't taste red anymore. It doesn't have that deep, resonant, beefy punch that we so badly want it to have. And every steak's in some sense a letdown. And then you have a really great steak, like I did. I went to visit my brother, I think it was 1996 or 97. He was living in Chile, and we had an Argentine tenderloin. And it was a mind-blowing experience. It was one of those experiences you put the beef in your mouth and everything slows down and you go, like, what's going on? And I asked the question that really did change the course of my life. I asked, why did this steak taste so good? And that's what led to the book. And that led to this deeper question about flavor. And what I found about steak, this trend of quantity and quality. I remember I was sitting with Temple Grandin. I interviewed her for the book. We spent some time together, which was terrific. Ate steak with Temple Grandin, which was awesome. And she said, it's not just steak. She said, it's happened to romaine lettuce. It's happening to everything. And it was such an astute comment. And I started to get more interested in, well, what's going on with food? That led to the Dorito Effect, which looked at our food system and what's happened to food. Everyone's concerned, what's happened to food? It's the question everybody wants the answer to. And I looked at it through the lens of flavor. And that was intentional, very purposeful, because we are all nutritionists. Ever since I can remember, the discussion's been about fat, it's been about carbs, it's been about protein, it's been about calories. And we have this talk about food as though nutrition takes place from the neck down. But the funny thing is, every time we sit down to eat a meal, we want it to taste good. And we behave as though flavor is some kind of a hangover from the Stone Age. It's meaningless, it's frivolous, it's going to get you into trouble. Well, in this book, I just wanted to say what has happened to food. I knew there was something going on with farm food, and what Temple Grandin, her inkling, turned out to be absolutely correct. All the food we grow is getting blander. Everything that comes off a farm, whether it walks off the farm or whether we pull it out of the ground or pluck it from a tree, it's getting blander because we keep on asking the land to produce more food. And it doesn't have to be, but there is this trade-off between quantity and quality. Now, it's a good thing we've got the quantity. The Green Revolution saved many lives. There'd be a lot of dead bodies because we got less farmland than we used to have, and we got far more bodies. But there's been a quality trade-off. And the food that we're told to eat, the wholesome food, is getting bland. At the same time, there's been a complementary reverse trend, which is that processed foods, we call them now ultra-processed foods, are getting ever more flavorful because literally the flavor compounds that are being lost at the farm level are being manufactured in flavor factories. There are factories that produce flavor compounds, and they're being put onto ultra-processed foods that are making ultra-processed foods ever more irresistible. So if you think of flavor as the incentive to eat, if you think of the pleasure and joy we take in the taste of food as being, one of the big reasons we eat, well, we took that incentive from the food we're supposed to eat, namely whole foods, wholesome foods, stuff from the farm, and we layered it on, we glossed it onto ultra-processed foods, to foods that don't taste like what they are. So I think it was, the very first page of the Dorito Effect, I said the definition of junk food. Everyone's got these, high calorie, this or that. I said it's food that tastes like something that it isn't. And that led to the End of Craving, because I knew in a very limited sense, when you put flavorings on a Dorito chip, I'll back up a bit. The reason I called it the Dorito Effect was because the first ever Doritos were just salted tortilla chips, and they bombed. It was a disaster. And the complaint was that the snack sounded Mexican, but it didn't taste Mexican. And the guy who actually created the Dorito, he wasn't supposed, they told him not to do it. And he went ahead and did it, and he created this tortilla chip snack that was bombing, and he had to explain himself. And they said, what are you going to do about Doritos? And he said, let's make them taste like taco. And this actually elicited laughs. They said, this was down in Texas, that's where Frito-Lay was located. And they said, our Yankee friend from the north doesn't understand the difference between a thing and a flavor. And this was the seminal moment when flavor technology had changed so that you could make anything you want taste like whatever you wanted it to taste like. So this is very important because we can talk about salt, sugar, and fat and calories. The difference between that salted tortilla chip and the taco-flavored Doritos had nothing to do with calories, salt, fat, sugar, anything like that. It had to do with this dusting of flavor compounds. So what we know is in the acute sense, I can put these flavor compounds on a tortilla chip, you'll eat more of them. If you think about soft drinks, everyone talks about soft drinks, they're sugary drinks. That's not why you drink them. If I gave you a glass of soda water with 7 tablespoons or whatever it is of sugar, you'd find it quite disgusting. I've tried it, it just doesn't taste good. It's the flavorings that make Coke taste like Coke, and Dr. Pepper tastes like Dr. Pepper, and Mountain Dew tastes like Mountain Dew, and 7-Up tastes like 7-Up. So I know that'll make people eat more in the moment, but in The End of Craving, this is my most recent book, I asked a deeper question is, what is the effect of all this fooling around, of all these false sensations that we're layering onto food? What does that do to us over time? And my belief is that this is so much of what's responsible for the obesity epidemic, because it's really confusing our brains. Our brains are getting signals about food that are misleading, and this is something we were never meant to deal with from an evolutionary point of view. It's not salt or fat or carbs or sugar that's changed. These are still the same fundamental nutrients they've always been. It's the signals the brain gets about the food that it's eating that's changed, and it's had a profound effect.
That's such an interesting evolution there. Those three stages. I can't help but think of the organic movement. And the organic movement really began in the 30s. Organic farming has existed for thousands of years, but it became a movement, and it was a political movement in response to the advent of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And there were a group of people, famously in Europe, who said, this isn't right. We're not improving our agriculture, we're deproving it. And Albert Howard famously was in India, meant to be as an extension agent, and instead he said he became the student. And he said the peasant and the pest became my teachers, because they were doing a very traditional agriculture, and he looked and he said the results are better. So the interesting thing to me is, and they were very focused on health. Mm-hmm. They weren't worrying about obesity, they were focused on health, and the health of the animals, the health of the ground, and the health of the people who were part of that system. And this was before ultra-processed food. So it's interesting. Yeah. So this is like going back to Temple Grandin's comment about, lettuce isn't what lettuce used to be, beef isn't what beef used to be. So already we're seeing this lessening of nutrition and flavor.
And this is stuff we've all heard from our grandparents. They remember what cream tasted like on the farm, or what eggs used to taste like.
Right.
And you think it's just the kind of you see the past through a rose-tinted lens, but it's not true. I mean, what they're saying is they're picking up something real.
And the USDA agrees. They've done the testing on the food since the 40s, and they see that it's nutritionally becoming less and less vital. Yeah. More and more simple, less complex, and diluted. Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting to me that there was a movement before we were dealing with obesity and all this ultra processing. And what I think is that things are getting worse in our food system as this becomes dominant. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing even worse outcomes. It's not just lower health, but it's now dramatic health outcomes through obesity. Through other things too, do you think? Through this masking of nutritional, failure, thinness, the things that actually nourish us? Do you think there are other health problems, or do you think obesity is really ground central?
Obesity is, it raises your risk profile for so many other diseases: type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's. As far as other diseases go, it's tough to say, because this is what the scientists would call ecological data, which you're looking at a whole society, country over time. So you might see like a rise in things like autism. Is that because of the food we eat? Is that because we're better at diagnosing it? People who are diagnosed with autism or being on the spectrum today, 40 years ago, were just weirdos or something like that. So it's difficult to say. I don't think it's a good thing. But I would say the other part of it, there's the pleasure part of it. You see, this is part of the problem. We're having this technical discussion about disease, and that's important. But the other part of it is that we've drained pleasure from real food. And this is also really important, because we eat 3 times a day, and pleasure is important to us. It's meant to it does nourish the soul. And when you take that away, you lose something really important. And I don't think these ultra-processed foods, they do have some kind of a hold on the brain. We know when you start eating those Doritos, it's hard to stop, but they're not truly pleasurable the way good food is, the way that you and I would think about the way a great tomato tastes, or a great steak, or mushroom toast, or great piece of sourdough bread. And that's what we're also losing, is a connection to how food was meant to taste, food that its flavor is connected to its past, that what you are tasting is what the food is. And I know it can sound kind of spiritual, but I really think there's something to that.
Well, you actually offered a lot of proof to what you're saying. I mean, a lot of scientific research to that. So, sure, let's go to teasing apart the difference between craving, wanting, and liking, pleasure, that they're not the same.
Yeah, so this is a really important point. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the research. It starts with a guy named Kent Berridge. I think it was 1985. You've probably heard of the neurotransmitter called dopamine. Everybody's, we keep on talking about dopamine hits. You get a dopamine hit from your smartphone, and they make it sound as though what was the prevailing belief at the time was that dopamine was pleasure. And Kent Berridge believed that dopamine was pleasure, so much so that he was trying to add to the body of research, which is what scientists do, showing that dopamine was pleasure. And what he did is he gave rats a drug that blocked dopamine in the brain. And he fired a little blast of sugar water into their mouths. And when rats eat something they like, they kind of lick their paws, they stick their tongue out, they make these cute little rat faces. And he thought, well, with dopamine suppressed, we're not going to get the pleasure response. And he got the pleasure response. And he's like, well, I screwed up. He did it again. It happened again. And he was trying to scratching his head going like, what is going on? So he thought, okay, he's gonna crank up the artillery. And he lesions the dopamine channels in the rat's brain. That part of the brain, dopamine's wiped out. These rats are incapable of experiencing pleasure. They were so kind of catatonic, they had to be fed through a feeding tube because they just weren't interested in feeding. So it looks like pleasure's gone. He fires sugar water back into their mouth. They make that cute little joyful rat expression. And he's really confused. This is not making sense. So now he does something completely different. He sticks electrodes in their brains and cranks up dopamine, these dopamine pleasure centers of the brain. And now the rats are just eating voraciously. Well, that seems right, doesn't it? Except now they're making the reverse facial expressions that they make when they don't like something. As though they're saying, I can't stop eating, but I'm not enjoying this. And he was so flummoxed by this, but eventually he put the piece of the puzzle together. And what he realized is that what we talk of as pleasure is actually two things. There's the quest, and then there's the receipt of pleasure. There is wanting, and then there is liking. And this is so important because we really lack this vocabulary for understanding how our pleasure relationship with the world, because they're two related but different sensations. And one of the most interesting things to me about our modern food environment is that it's really tweaked this wanting sense. One of the most interesting things about obesity, everybody thinks people with obesity, well, they just indulge themselves too much. They lose themselves in the pleasures of food. But when we look at the neuroimaging of obesity, we find that they actually don't receive more pleasure from food. They receive less pleasure. The difference comes in this plume of wanting. When they see the slice of pizza, when they smell the hamburger, when they see that milkshake, they really want it, but it doesn't deliver that expected pleasure. So it's really a miserable state of affairs. And I think this is really important because we've deluded ourselves into thinking that we live in this ultra pleasurable food environment. We talk about foods like cheeseburgers and Doritos being hyper palatable. I don't think they are. There's a cheap quality. It's like watching a stupid movie that it's a stupid movie, but it's got this plot that you just want to see what happens. They have a hold on us, but it doesn't deliver true pleasure. And I think this is really important. I'll tell you why. Because when you look at the cultures that value food the most, in the West it's Italy, and in the East it's Japan. Their BMIs are microscopic compared to America's BMI. In Italy, in the north of Italy, where they don't eat a Mediterranean diet, by the way. They eat a lot of cream, a lot of pasta, a lot of Parmesan cheese, a lot of cured pork products. The rate of obesity is less than 10%. It's been holding steady. It's not budging. And they eat incredible food. I spent so much time in Bologna. This is a city that's obsessed with food. You might almost think they have an eating disorder because at their Chamber of Commerce, they have an official repository of official recipes. If you're gonna make lasagna, this is how you make lasagna. If you're gonna make tortellini, this is how you make tortellini. If you're gonna make their famous bolognese, ragusa bolognese, that wonderful sauce that they have with the tagliatelle noodle, this is how you make that sauce. And they actually have that noodle. It's their favorite noodle. It's about the size of a fettuccine, but it's made with fresh ingredients. It's made with fresh flour and eggs, fresh eggs, carbs and fat, these two nutrients we've been freaking out over for decades. They have that noodle cast in gold. This is the perfect tagliatelle noodle. That's how much they revere food. So you'd think these people visit Bologna from all over the world. People go to Italy just so they can eat as the Italians are eating. Well, you'd think, well, if delicious food is our enemy, and it's delicious food that is making us eat ourselves into an early grave, well, surely the Italians will be the plumpest, and yet they're the trimmest. And then you look across the Pacific Ocean in Japan. The Japanese are equally, if not more, fixated on definitions and the provenance of food. They call it brands. Everyone's heard of Kobe beef. That is a brand of beef. It must be made a certain way, and it must come from Kobe. If you break those rules, you can get in trouble with the law. The Japanese have these rules for so many things. They teach their kids how to eat. They teach their kids what words like umami means. That's a Japanese word. The food in Japan is unbelievable. I was there for almost 2 weeks. I don't think I could have found a bad meal if I'd wanted to. I ate a rice ball on a train. That's raw fish surrounded by rice. If you eat food on a train in North America, it's like a suicide quest. Can you imagine eating raw fish on a train? And it was incredible. The rate of obesity in Japan is even less than Italy. It's like 4 or 5%. So on the one hand, this is telling us something very encouraging. It means you can have this incredible relationship with food, eat wonderful food, and not pay this terrible price of being tremendously overweight and having all these health problems. But it's also telling us something even more important, that we're getting this completely wrong.
Okay. Just one thing before we move on. That amazing pasta in Italy made out of flour and eggs. I'm guessing that was not American flour and industrial eggs.
Not industrial eggs. The flour is probably Canadian. There's actually a brand of flour in Italy called Manitoba. And now, is it from Manitoba? I don't know. It might be from Saskatchewan. Might be from Alberta. They cannot grow all their own wheat in Italy. It is different from ours, though, in that it's not enriched. So it's although it's Canadian flour, it's not the flour that I as a Canadian would buy.
Yeah, okay.
And that's important. We'll get to that, but that's a very important distinction.
Yeah, I just, we go back to those initial depletion of the raw ingredients being significant in all this. I think that depletion drives the flavor industry as part of what fuels it. It becomes self-propelling after a while. It doesn't care. We're in a system where people are constantly getting the latest flavor of Doritos and the latest Powerade and the latest, version. It seems like what you're describing has set it off and is continuing to fuel it, but it seems like a kind of a crazy machine that is running amok.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of a self-fueling thing. Although not in certain cultures. It's funny, if you go to Italy, you go to like a little convenience store, and they have this little fridge at the front of the store where you can get a Coke or a Fanta. They have their, potato chips that taste like prosciutto. I think there was another, they have like paprika flavored potato chips. So it's not as though junk food doesn't exist there. And they do drink soft drinks, but they only drink about 1/5 the amount of soft drinks that we do. So far, far less. You don't really see people eating potato chips, certainly not as often as you would here. They do have, it's not like they're banned or something. They're there. They just don't have, What's funny is in the middle of the street, there'll be this little stand, and instead of selling junk food, they're selling things like mortadella and these little panini sandwiches. So they've just got a much better food culture.
Okay, so that's a question. Is this about culture?
I mean, it's difficult to say. Everyone says, it sounds like that's a culture thing. Well, if it is a culture thing, then all we should be doing is talking about culture. I think it goes deeper than that. I got really interested in this question of Italy, and I want to know what is it that's different about Italy versus us. And I started to look back in the history books, and what I found actually surprised me, because I found out that there was a time in Italy, northern Italy in particular, when it wasn't actually different from us, it was actually the same. This is going back a little more than a century. They had an epidemic of something called pellagra, which is an Italian word in a local dialect. It means rough skin. And it was this mysterious disease. It was one of the first people to notice it was the famous German writer Goethe. He noticed it when he was doing this kind of tour of Italy. And it would start in the spring, and it would be like these strange skin scales. And then it might go away, but it would come back the next spring, and it might be worse. And it would get worse and worse. People would get diarrhea. They'd get delirium. They attacked children. They did all sorts of bizarre things, and eventually would lead to death. Well, pellagra mysteriously crossed the pond and showed up, I think it was in Georgia first, and it started to spread across the south. And the south became the pellagra belt. And it was very much like the obesity epidemic insofar as it was an epidemic and it had to do, and no one knew what was causing it. There was all sorts of strange theories. Sometimes they thought it had to do with moisture. They said if you lived too close to a river or too far from a river, you could get pellagra, but if you lived just the right distance, you didn't. For some reason, divorced men would get pellagra, but married men didn't. Jews didn't seem to get pellagra. Some people said it was mosquitoes. Some people said it was sandflies. There was 100 different theories. Nobody knew what it was until this guy, an epidemiologist named Joseph Goldberger, was sent down to a sanatorium. And they thought he was nuts because he said, don't touch a thing. He said, don't clean the rooms, don't do any more extra laundry. But he said, let's feed them differently. And he said, let's give the inmates things like peas and milk and cheese and maybe meat if they could afford it. And the pellagra went away. And that was one of the most important findings in what would become the science of nutrition, because they realized that there was some essential element in food that caused this disease. If this element wasn't there in the sufficient quantity, you got this strange disease. That element is what we now call niacin, vitamin B3. And that was the beginning of our comprehension of essential nutrients. So the discovery of niacin and the discovery of this pellagra-preventing diet really changed nutrition. But what's so interesting is when you look at how North America dealt with the pellagra problem and how Italy dealt with it. North America married cutting-edge science with public policy. We mandated the fortification of flour. We said, let's add, if people need niacin, let's add niacin. They also said, let's add these other B vitamins, riboflavin and thiamine. And they also said, let's throw in some iron for good measure. It started with, I think it was white bread, but then it slowly expanded to things like pasta. And now it's in pretty much any flour product, even in corn flour. It's all enriched. Enriched is when it's enrichment and fortification are the same thing. They call it enrichment when the government says you got to do it. What's so funny is Italy didn't do that. The approach that Italy took, it's like they were still stuck in the Dark Ages. They said things like, well, poor people should raise rabbits because rabbits are, an economical form of meat, and we should have communal bread ovens, and maybe people with pellagra should drink wine. And you just think, like, are you guys idiots? Funnily enough, it actually wasn't bad advice because back then the wines weren't very well filtered. They had all sorts of yeast in them, and yeast is an amazing source of niacin. What's even more interesting is that it actually worked. Didn't work as quickly, but Italy literally ate its way out of a nutritional deficiency. Now here's where things get more interesting. Fast forward the clock 100 years. What was the pellagra belt has become the obesity belt, or it's become the diabetes belt. You look at Italy, and what was the pellagra belt is now northern Italy, arguably the most economically productive part of Europe, even more economically productive than the Rhine Valley. Northern Italy has got serious amounts of money. And I just don't want to create the sense it's a bunch of rich people. It's an incredibly functional, beautiful society. It's where they design their beautiful sports cars, where the fashion comes from. They really have lifestyle nailed down. Architecture is beautiful. The food's great. Northern Italy is an amazing place to live. And they have this wonderful relationship with food. Meanwhile, what the heck happened in the American South? You'd think that this exacting science of nutrition would have fixed the problem. And on the surface, it sort of looks like it made it worse. Now, what I find so interesting about this approach is the assumptions behind each one, because the American approach said, okay, there's something wrong with food, in that sometimes food doesn't have these nutrients that you need, and there's something wrong with humans, because we don't know what to eat. We'll eat this food that makes us sick. So let's step in and fix what's wrong with food. And that's what we did. Italy said, no, there's nothing wrong with food. The problem is people are too poor to afford food, so let's give poor people food. What's so interesting about the American approach is that this is the approach we kept on taking. Now we fortify breakfast cereals. You can get energy drinks from Starbucks that have twice the amount of riboflavin, I think it is, or niacin that you actually need. We've thought that the cold, precise hand of science can fix everything to do with food. If you look at things like plant-based meats, they call it the impossible burger, because there's this idea that we can break these bonds of nature and do something almost supernatural. And it doesn't work. Even the idea that you can flavor a Dorito to taste like taco, we never questioned it because we just thought flavor was this stupid thing that didn't make any sense in the first place. Whereas over in Italy, they say things like, well, you can't call plant-based milk because it's not milk, or plant-based meat is not meat. So, and we think they're kind of these, what's this funny traditional attitude. Their system works much better than ours because they have a reverence for for food, the way it tastes and where it comes from, because they think taste really does matter. And it does matter.
Okay, so I am struck by something here. I'm curious what you think about it. The power of how you look at something. I mean, we're talking about two enormously different ways of responding to the same problem, which is a bunch of people who are eating a poor diet because they're economically disadvantaged. And in America, it was, let's add all of these inputs, which actually sounds a great deal like chemical agriculture to me. We have a problem, the land is not thriving, let's add chemical fertilizers, and then voila, we get big green plants, and voila, I think it leads to a great many problems. In northern Italy, they're taking the same problem, and let's figure out how we can change people's access to good food, which I think is more like saying, how can we build an organic system so that the land maintains its fertility by improving the cycling of nutrients and water, and that the outcome is we don't need the pesticides. We haven't created a whole secondary set of problems. Does that hold up for you?
Yeah, it does. I don't know if I thought of it specifically in those terms, but there is a knock-on effect that is, I think, directly like that, and that has to do with the effects of these vitamins they're adding to food. This is something I got interested in the Dorito Effect because I talked about the work of Fred Provenza and how the work he would do with goats, where you could make them deficient in a needed nutrient. He did phosphorus, and then he'd pair that to a flavoring. So like something like coconut, so that when the goats became deficient in phosphorus, they would crave the flavor of coconut. So you pair this flavoring with a vitamin. What I also realized is it could work the other way around. If you start putting vitamins in things, does that start to mess things up? And I got curious about what are these, has there been a consequence of this dumping of vitamins into food that we haven't seen? I know it sounds nuts. I mean, we're into tinfoil hat territory here, because vitamins, I mean, like the word vital is part of vitamins. There's no calories in vitamins. How could there be anything wrong with vitamins? Vitamins are the nourishing elements of what make food nourishing to begin with. But there is a problem with it. And the reason we know is because we can look at how animal agriculture changed. And I knew this, I had suspected this for a long time, but I couldn't find the science. It wasn't until the algorithms in Google Scholar got good enough that I finally found the body of research. And it comes to us from pig farming. If you look at pig farming in the 1950s, they were doing all sorts of things to try and improve yield, because that's what the animal scientists have always been trying to do, is just get more bang for our buck, so to speak. And they were doing things like they were inbreeding pigs for generations to try and get these traits to grow bigger, faster. Most of it didn't work. But they also knew, as this science of nutrition came along, it started to change things. What they knew back then was that there was a rocket fuel feed for pigs. It was corn and soy. That if you gave them corn and soy, they would grow, they would just take off. But they also knew that's not all you could give them, because if that's all you gave them, the growth takes off, then it craters. And then they start to lose their hair, they seem to get dizzy, they can't walk, they get terrible diarrhea, scours, and then they die. They were getting something like the pig version of pellagra or a different nutritional deficiency. They knew back then that you had to send the pigs out into pasture to balance the diet. They didn't know why, but everybody pastured pork back then, not because it was trendy, but because you had to, because you couldn't just feed pigs corn and soy. Then comes the B vitamins. And there's these amazing trials where they start to take this corn soy diet and they start to just sprinkle in one B vitamin at a time. And all of a sudden we see, instead of cratering, the growth takes off and it keeps going. And this changed pig farming. They start to get levels of growth that were unimaginable. They called it optimal. And very quickly, the model of pig farming changed. There's this great document I found, I think it was put out by the University of Illinois in the late 1950s, basically telling farmers, this is what you do now. It said things like, pigs have a reasonable ability to naturally balance their diet, but we have a better science of it now. And they talked about optimal weight gain. So when we talk about CAFOs and confinement animal agriculture, whether it's feedlots or whether it's chicken houses or whether it's these facilities we've created for pigs, I don't even know what to call them. It's not a barn. I don't know what it is. They've got these factories now in China. None of that would have been possible without the science of micronutrition. Vitamins is what made that possible. Because before that, you needed to send your chickens, you needed to give them green feed and table scraps or send them outside. Pigs had to be pastures, and cows had to have access to grass. You could give them some grain, but they needed grass. Vitamins changed everything. Without the revolution in our understanding of essential nutrients, we would not have confinement animal feeding. It wouldn't exist. So in that regard, it's very much like what you're talking about.
You know, that's actually a really stunning thing. I don't think most people understand that. I think people think, well, we've got confinement livestock now. So, let's say lots of people think that they're not in love with that because the animals lead such a hard life there. But they think that this is the inevitable consequence of increasing efficiency. But it actually is not about efficiency in terms of the systems. Yes, you can make a very efficient system if you don't have to pay attention to a whole diet for the animal because you can just hit them with the vitamins.
Yeah, well, what's also interesting is that they have to feed restrict the seed stock, the animals that you use to get your eggs or your piglets or your calves, because they will get morbidly obese. So this is not really a sustainable diet. But here's where it gets really scary, because I'm talking about additives we put into animal feed. Well, we're putting these same stuff into human feed. If you look at a box of cereal, it's these same vitamins. So we talk about the obesity epidemic, and I think one of the things that has so empowered it is the fact that we've created the rocket fuel, that we've taken these empty carbs and put in the B vitamins that are necessary to process, to metabolize those carbs. So here's what's really interesting about the pellagra diet. It was not this starvation diet of people, starving. It was actually an incredibly calorie-rich diet. What did the poor Southerners eat? They ate grits, which is cornmeal, with molasses and pork fat. Carbs, sugar, and fat. They had calories galore, and yet they were starving. Why? Because a calorie, we think of calories like energy in the wall. Calories are pure energy. They're not. Without the necessary micronutrients, the body can't metabolize those calories. So niacin's a really interesting one, because it turns out that fructose metabolism, fructose is a simple sugar, it's the fruit sugar, it's 1/2 of sucrose. Sucrose is glucose plus fructose. Fructose is also in high fructose corn syrup, which we've been using in soft drinks and all sorts of processed food for a few decades now. Well, there's something interesting about fructose, is that it requires a whole boatload of niacin to be metabolized. So we're worried about sugar consumption. We talk about kids drinking way too much soda and eating too much candy. All this sugar consumption, if you're going to metabolize that sugar, you need a boatload of niacin. High sugar metabolism requires niacin. So we think that vitamins are pure and blameless, but they are playing a role in this. And so I think one of the things that makes Italians skinny is the fact that they're not getting their B vitamins in their flour, that they have to get it in their leafy greens, for example. And then when you eat leafy greens, it takes up stomach capacity. It means you're not eating something calorie dense. And they love those foods. They actually have a whole party in Veneto. They love these members of the chicory family that are so bitter. They have street parties. They love it. So you say it's culture. It is culture. But I think there's something even more elemental that comes down to nutrition and the relationship with the food that enters your body and how that food is made, how it's grown and how it's made and how it's altered or not altered.
So, just to be clear...
Oh, radicchio, by the way. It's radicchio.
Radicchio. Yeah, right. So when we talk about, when the motivation for enriching this rocket fuel for the livestock was that they would grow fast, they would put on weight fast.
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
and you can look at the... Exactly, and the pigs we eat now are bigger but much younger than the pork we ate 50 or 60 years ago.
It would not make them healthier.
I wouldn't say so, no.
No. And they don't last so long, but they grow very quickly. So when we're doing the same thing to our own food, not to mention we're eating those animals,
yes,
which are not the same meat as animals fed very differently, and we're enriching the food that we're getting that are not animals with the same kind of rocket fuel, It kind of sounds like we're creating CAFOs for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I think there's a lot of striking and unnerving parallels between the food that we feed ourselves, and our kids especially, and the foods that we feed livestock.
And it's not making us healthier either.
No, I mean, look, like childhood, they had to change the name of it used to be adult onset diabetes, and they had to change the name to type 2 because kids started getting it. That's a new thing. I mean, we see the rates of obesity with kids, it's taking off. It's frightening. It's also, you know how I said that the obesity rate in Italy is less than 10%? That's true, but here's what's even more interesting. There's like class 2 and class 3 obesity. I think class 3 is a BMI of over 40. I think, I can't remember I think it's 13% of Americans now are there. In Italy, it's like vanishingly small. I mean, it barely exists. So it's almost as though their food doesn't have the capacity to generate the levels of obesity that we can pull off. So to me, that's kind of like an input-output thing. They just can't do what we're doing. I don't know if it's possible to be fat in Italy the way Americans are. I just don't think it's possible.
Because they're not getting enough rocket fuel.
Yeah.
So, and just again, to talk about the cultural piece, I just interviewed a woman, a chef named Eliza Daly, wonderful, doing these wonderful education programs in the schools around San Diego region. And for kids who don't have access to great food at home, they have a breakfast program there. And she was stunned to learn that the kids were being fed like large chocolate donuts for breakfast.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute, what crazy world is that? Where this is the food you're saying, these kids aren't getting good food, we're going to give them chocolate donuts for breakfast.
It's great. And the thing is, we're a wealthy country. This is a wealthy society we live in. When you look at GDP per capita, I mean, we are way up there. So, you know, another aspect of culture you can talk about is how they feed school children in Italy and France. I had a friend in Italy. I had this summer job in Brussels when I was in university, and there was an Italian kid, and he raved about the pasta that he ate at school. He loved the chef. It was like it was his grandmother. He said the food was so great. A friend of mine, Bill Buford, a great author, spent many years in Lyon, where his kids entered the local school system, and they were learning about all the great French sauces. It's part of their culture. The Japanese teach their kids about food. And the food that we feed our kids in the school system it's I don't want to say it's like we're trying to kill them, but you're just like, I mean, who would think a chocolate donut is a breakfast for a kid? I'd slap that on my child's hand. I think, what are you eating? You can't eat that.
Right. Okay, so that's part of our culture too. So, you know, as we contemplate, how do we change this, Mark?
Yeah, well, part of it's this attitude. Like, so what would make someone think it's okay to eat a donut? And I think the idea is that, I don't know, that's a tough one. But I think part of what I was talking about earlier was this idea of, that nutrition takes place from the neck down. That we're so fixated on nutrients that we think there's some way we can figure this out. And then we also think that we can control, if we just make the right decisions, if I go on a ketogenic diet, if I go on this kind of a diet, it's all going to work. I don't think that works. The problem with eating, the problem with the appetite, is that it's controlled by the same parts of the brain that control things like breathing or blinking or sweating or your heart rate. This is a controlled system. This idea that we can control our body weight by decisions we make it's folly. It's just not true. The brain regulates body weight. I think it was Jules Hirsch at Rockefeller University. I think this is the 1950s as well, maybe the early 60s. I might be getting the dates wrong, but he did an experiment where he had morbidly obese patients and he put them on a liquid diet, low calorie diet. I think it was something like 600 calories a day, maybe higher, but they all lost weight. They were all thin. They all became trim. And it was this glorious day when they all said their tearful goodbyes and went off to live these wonderful lives, and they all gained the weight right back. And this is when science began to understand that appetite isn't this kind of voluntary thing, that there's something deep going on in the brain. It's neurologically controlled. But what's so interesting about it is that the brain defends against losing weight. We know that from the Minnesota starvation experiments, where you start to starve people, they just become obsessed with food. What's also interesting is that when you put people with obesity on a strict diet, they have a similar response. It's called semi-starvation neurosis. It's as though they're starving, even though they're not. But what's also really interesting is that the brain doesn't just defend against losing weight, it also defends against gaining weight. This is where it gets mind-blowing. It was Ethan Sims who did an experiment. He started to do it first with rodents. He tried to get them fat, and he couldn't. He had to force feed them. And then they would work harder and try to, it's like they're trying to lose weight or something. Then he tried it with college students. He thought, well, college students are always looking for a free meal. If you can get anyone fat, it'll be a college student. He couldn't get them fat. He had to go to a prison. And even then, it was hard to keep these prisoners enrolled in the study because they found being forced to eat too much food was miserable. And the ones that he did get to gain weight, when the experiment ended, they would snap back to their old weight. Just the way people go on a diet, snap back to their old weight. So there's this thing going on where there's this deep part of your brain saying, this is how much I want you to weigh.
Okay. So these people who were morbidly obese and then they went on the liquid diet and they got skinny and then they went out on the street and they put all the weight back on. If they'd gone back, if we'd said, and here's a ticket to Northern Italy,
Great question.
Would they have not put the weight back on?
That's such a good question. And the problem is I can't find data. We've got a lot of data on people immigrating to the United States because this is a magnet for people to come to. And we know that whenever, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're Italian or you're Japanese or Korean, everybody comes here and they gain weight. What we don't have is good data on people going to these other countries. What I have is anecdotal data. And I was going to put this in the book, but I decided not to because I wanted the book to strictly adhere to peer-reviewed science. But I have lots of anecdotes. I talked to a guy who worked for a company that made the nacelles. That's the casing for jet engines. And he got a contract to work in Bordeaux for Airbus for something like 6 months. And he and a bunch of Americans, I think he was from Oklahoma, they went and lived in Bordeaux. And he was a guy he loved cycling. And all he could say is, I mean, they lived to eat when they were there. They racked up the biggest bills at the cafeteria. People would marvel at them. He loved going out to eat. And the other problem is, he was not getting on his bike as often as he was. It's just different country. You know, he was not putting the miles on, and he dreaded getting on the scale. Turns out he lost weight. He worked with a woman who said she could, now felt okay wearing a bikini again. I got sick shortly after I'd written the first draft, and I remember there was a nurse. I was getting kind of this complex procedure, and she would go to visit her, I think it was some kind of a relative in Italy every year. And she said every year she would go and she said, I'd, eat like a queen and lose weight. I was contacted by a nutritionist in Chicago, and she talked about it. I think she has a sister who lives in Japan and moved to Japan, raving about the food, lost weight. So that's a really good question. Had those people in Jules Hirsch's experiment been sent to Northern Italy, would they lose weight? I think they would. But that's something I'd love to see real science done on that.
I mean, there's got to be something there because everyone comes here and they put on weight.
Yes.
And it's an interesting thing. There's also the question about, the quality of how the food is prepared and all that. My wife went to Italy and she was blown away by how good the food tasted.
It's really, it
was just, it's just simple food.
Yeah, and the simpler the better. The funny thing about Italian food is when they try to get fancy, never do this, but if you go to a Michelin 2 or 3 star restaurant in Italy, it's like it's not very good. They're not good at ritzing it up. It's these beautiful kind of peasant-inspired dishes that are just,
exactly.
They make you cry. They're so good.
Right. How much of that do you think is, of course, okay, there's the lack of the flavors being put in, the fake flavors. How much of that is the quality of the raw materials of the food?
That's a huge, important part of it, hugely important. And Italians, this is what they care about. This is why we it strikes us as funny. They've got these DOP products in Europe. It's basically domain origin protect. I'm not going to get it right, but it means where it comes from is protected. And Italy has more of these products than anybody. A good example would be Parmigiano Reggiano. We call it Parmesan cheese, but this is, to be Parmigiano Reggiano, it's got to be certain cows can only eat grass. It's got to be made a certain way in this region. There's San Marzano tomatoes. What's a San Marzano tomato? It's this kind of tomato, genetic strain, raised in this area according to these standards. If you want to call it a San Marzano, you've got to meet those criteria. Italy has more of these foods than anybody. The Japanese are also big. I mentioned Kobe beef. They've got Matsuzaka beef. They've got what they call brands for all sorts of things, apples. They think where food comes from tells you an awful lot about how it's going to taste and its value. And we think it's cute and funny, and we love it when we go there. The food tastes great. I think they're really onto something. I think they understand something very important about food. They also care about pleasure in a way that we don't. I mean, we say if it tastes good, spit it out, and we think I got to eat more protein and stuff like that. For them, every meal is an opportunity to indulge yourself. One of the most interesting statistics I came across when researching this book is that Italians and French eat not double, but or not half, but significantly fewer calories than Americans, and yet it takes them twice as long. And you're like, are you just like chewing in slow motion? Like, what's going on? Well, in a way they are, because their meals are more like social occasions. They don't eat in front of the TV. They don't eat in the car, not because they have a rule, not because some nutritionist said, don't eat in the car, it's a bad habit. They'd be like, why would you distract yourself from this wonderful meal you're having while you're trying to drive a car? They don't, and I'm guilty of this. I drink coffee in the car. They go to a coffee place, they sit at the bar, they get their espresso, they talk to one another. So their whole relationship with food is much more social. And I think this is important because when you think about, we love to eat. There's two interesting things. It's awful to watch a comedy by yourself, and it's awful to eat a great meal by yourself. In both cases, you always think, wouldn't it be great if someone else were here? It enriches the experience. And the interesting thing about relationships, I think about my wife, for example, when we have a great meal together, the experience of me sharing that meal with my wife makes the food taste better. But there's this reciprocal thing happening where this great food makes our relationship better. So there's this aspect of food and being a social animal that's really important that we've totally lost track of.
This makes me think about one of the famous debates in the organic movement was the organic Twinkie debate. And Joan Gussow had this debate with the guy who started Cascadian Farms, Gene Kahn. And they were both on the National Organic Standards Board. Do you know who Joan is? She's a professor of nutrition at Columbia, and she was the chair, and she invented this great course about food and agriculture, and let's look at it and talk about it and dive in. Really, she's an amazing teacher. She just retired last year at 92 or 93. Wow. Right, still going. And Joan did not believe that you could have an organic Twinkie, that's not what organic meant. And Mark, I won't speak for Gene. Let's just say that some people would say, why not? If the corn is grown organically and the sugar is grown organically, then it's an organic Twinkie. And it's a really interesting question about what does organic mean? And can there be such a thing as organic junk food? I've seen for sale in a store certified organic gummy bears. And, I would say, well, that's not really organic. That organic really is about a food revolution. I'm not saying you should never eat a gummy bear or a Twinkie. Have at it, whatever you want. But it's not what organic means. Organic is about a whole system, an ecosystem. It's not about a product. It's not about an ingredient. It's not even about a practice. It's about a system, to me. And to many others, not just to me. So this is an interesting question about, do we look at the system, or do we just look at, and we don't care what you use these ingredients for?
Well, to me, it comes down to the difference between complexity and simplicity. So the reason I would say, maybe you can't have an organic Twinkie is because the ingredients you're using are essential elements you've taken out of these whole foods. This is the issue I have with plant-based meat, because they've taken all the things that make plants so special, the fiber, the plant secondary compounds, and they've just taken these extracts like pea protein and so forth. Now, it comes from a plant, technically, but I mean, if that's plant-based, Coca-Cola is plant-based, Doritos are plant-based. Plant-based is not the same as being a plant. I mean, when I look at it that way, I think, well, isn't a hamburger from a cow plant-based? Because the cow ate the plant, and the cow processed that into meat, just the way some factory you have processes it into one of these, confectionery burgers. And I think a cow, especially a pasture-raised one, actually honors the plant more, and that more of that plant is measurable. You can taste it. Grass-fed beef it expresses the land that it came from. So I think of it as the difference between complexity and simplicity. Humans are great simplifiers. One of the things I learned in the Dorito Effect was when we make flavors, we simplify. If you take something like vanilla, there's going to be hundreds of flavor compounds in vanilla. Well, what we did originally with vanilla was we just found vanillin, which is the character flavor impact compound. And vanillin is like the cartoon vanilla. It's just, yeah, it's just kind of the simple sort of dumb, like panting Irish setter version of vanilla. Whereas if you get really good Madagascar vanilla, it's just this nuanced, wonderful, rich, deep experience. And that, I think, is the difference between junk food and real food, is the experience of eating it. And it's not, I can talk about complexity, but it's not just registering complexity. It's not just like the way like a symphony has more notes than playing a chord. It's the way it makes you feel. And this gets back to the distinction between wanting and liking that we talked about. When you eat junk food, there's foods that make you eat faster and there's foods that make you eat slower. And this is a really important distinction, because if you start to eat Doritos, like we've all been in that situation, you go to a party, you're like, I'll just have one. And you have one and you have another, and then your hands get zesty and then you're kind of like, what the hell? And you wash your hands. And then you go and do it again and your hands get zesty again. You're like, what is wrong with me? The same thing happens on those rare occasions I'm stuck in an airport and I have to eat fast food. I'm blown away at how quickly this like 1,300 calorie meal goes down. I mean, you can almost measure it in seconds because it's not very many minutes that transpire. And yet I'm still kind of hungry. The gap has not been filled. And then there's meals that slow things down. And I spent some time with a researcher in Germany who looks at disordered eating. And a really good example is dark chocolate. We did this experiment where we did it first with potato chips. And she gave me these 2 potato chips and she said, no, you can't eat them. She says, you can nibble them, you can sniff them. And she said, something I thought was odd. She said, you can rub them together. I thought, that's stupid, who's gonna rub potato chips together? But I did, and I couldn't believe. I was seized by this wave of wanting. I wanted to eat those chips so badly. And she said, now throw those in the garbage. And it just seemed like awful to do that, but I did. And then she said, now take 2 fresh ones. And now I had 2 even fresher, more pristine, more beautiful chips. And it was amazing to experience this gripping wanting. I mean, this really captures some people and ruins their lives, but we've all experienced it. And it really made me understand the strange power these foods have over us. And then we got rid of that. And now we did an experiment that focused on the experience of liking. And she gave me this chocolate. You know, we're in Germany. The Europeans have wonderful chocolate. It was dark chocolate surrounding this little biscuit center. She said, just put it in your mouth and close your eyes. And at first nothing happened. I thought, no, there's not a whole lot going on. It's kind of cold and square and I could kind of feel the corners and hitting the roof of my mouth. And then it slowly started to melt and it kind of moved. There's this little smudge of chocolate and then the chocolate landed on my tongue. And then this plume of flavor kind of erupts in my mouth. And then the chocolate starts to melt. And then all of a sudden I got to the biscuit part and I forgot. I was like, oh my God, I forgot that it had this like biscuity cookie center. And I crunched it and it had this crunch. And this little square of chocolate, I don't know how long it took. It was like on a journey. Like I kind of woke up and I was like, she was like my shaman. I was like, it was remarkable. And it was amazing how much pleasure this one little square of dark chocolate delivered versus those potato chips. That such completely different experiences, both of which we call delicious on some level when you're eating that Dorito versus dark chocolate. And I think it's that experience we need to focus on. I think the food experiences in Italy and in Japan are more like the dark chocolate. They are immersive experiences that you contemplate, that you remember. No one ever says, wow, the best food I ever had was a bag of potato chips. I think it was North Carolina. I was at a truck stop. No one ever says that. But you might talk about, I remember some mushroom toast I had in northern Spain. I can talk about some of the steaks I've had, glasses of wine, peaches, fruit. I love fruit. Some of the pizza I've had in Italy. These are foods that make you, it was that steak that changed my life, that made me go, why does this steak taste so good? It slowed everything down. And these are moments you remember and you chase, you want to get them back. It's why you and I will talk about great tomatoes and we'll trade recipes, because the experience of food can be so absolutely wonderful. So, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could get back towards that and away from these foods that are taking us to such a bad place?
All right, I want to go there in just a second, but I have one question before. You've talked about food is information, mm-hmm. and I think that's a very important idea. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. Your brain, it has a sensorium. We sense. Your brain, when it comes to food, your brain doesn't read, it doesn't take nutrition courses, it doesn't read the nutrition panel or the ingredient panel. All it has is what it can sense. And it's very important that your brain senses what's in food, because it takes at least 20 minutes more to metabolize a meal. So your brain has to figure out what to eat, and it has to do so in a particular amount of time to make sure it's gotten enough, but not too much, because it's got to go and do other things. So your brain predicts what's coming in. What does it do? Well, first by seeing, then by smelling, then by tasting. And it turns out this whole system of sensing, it just goes on constantly. It doesn't end at the mouth. There's actually sensors in your stomach and the digestive tract. And this is how your brain creates a map of the world around it by what it can sense and what it can predict. And the sensory information of food for millions of years was stable. If something tasted sweet, it's because it had sugar in it. The more sweet it tasted, the more sugar, the more energy it had. The mouth, if you think of your genome as your instruction manual, the nose and mouth are the biggest chapters. So this is obviously really important from an evolutionary point of view, very complex. When you taste food, it engages more gray matter than any other activity, more than having sex or doing calculus. So there's something really elemental and important happening when you taste food. One of the reasons also that we have to predict what's coming in is because we're not like a fighter jet that can refuel. Like you could never eat while you're running, for example. So we have to partition food, and we have to partition what the body's doing with it. I talk about this kid, it was like 100 years ago. He drank this clam chowder that was like searingly hot and actually ended up searing his esophagus shut. It's a tragic story. Doctors created a fistula in his stomach, and he would feed himself with just by putting food in kind of through a funnel. But what was so interesting is he couldn't just put the food in, this great act of nourishment, of just putting nutrients in his stomach, which is what we think it's all about. He had to taste it first. Otherwise, he didn't feel right. So there's also this thing called the cephalic phase, that you start to secrete insulin just when you start to taste food, because your brain knows it's coming. I got to get ready. I got to get the body ready. So if you look at glucose in particular, it's really interesting that your brain is like a suspicious accountant, because it tastes glucose in the mouth, then in the stomach, but it's like it doesn't trust what's going on. It actually waits to see if the glucose gets oxidized, because in rats, if you use a drug that blocks glucose oxidation, that the glucose can't get burned, the rats will lose their preference for that sipper or that food or that flavor that's carrying the glucose. So that's how complex our sensory apparatus is, and that's how smart your brain is. So this whole idea that we're like this, ogre from the Stone Age that just wants to stuff our faces, and it's just you have this flavor here, and then it's just all nutrients. It's wrong. The brain controls so much of how much we weigh, but what we want to eat. But this whole system has to do with prediction and measurement. And when we start to fool the brain, when we think it's going to get 200 calories and it gets 100 or it gets 200, this creates what psychologists call uncertainty. The more technical term for it is reward prediction error. Something very simple, that the expected reward I didn't receive, or maybe it was even better than what I expected. And every time this happens, your brain starts to kind of recalibrate, do a recalculation. But when it's uncertain, when it really doesn't know what's coming next, that's what we call uncertainty. This has a very predictable effect on brains. There's a big body of psychological scholarship on it. And what it does is it causes enhanced motivation. When something becomes uncertain, we work harder for it. And it's universal. It happens to all of us. I'll give you a great example. When you're waiting for an elevator and you press the call button and it lights up, but nothing's happening. So what do? You press it again, you start to jab that stupid thing, right? Or the walk signal, or your TV's not working, you start to slap it, because it's this motivation thing. We get extra motivated and we work harder to achieve the uncertain reward. So evolution did not craft us to be calorie mongers that are on a lifelong quest to stuff ourselves, but it did craft us to respond to uncertainty with enhanced motivation. That's why we gamble. Gambles are always about uncertainty. Do you want to bet on the game tonight? Do you want to pull this lever for the slot machine? It gets us excited. That's the most interesting thing about it. It gets us excited. And remember how I told you that when we look at brain images of people with obesity, we see more wanting, less liking? That's the motivation. That's where we see this evidence of what this uncertainty that we've literally baked into all our food is having. It's making people want food more because the brain is getting confused. It's getting these signals that don't match what it's getting, and it responds by wanting more.
So do you think, Mark, that if we gave people food that did not give them distorted signals, so if we said, these people just lost a lot of weight, they came out of this liquid diet, and they have a choice, we can give them a ticket to northern Italy, where hopefully they're going to maintain that, and they can eat whatever they want, and their body will self-regulate. Do you think that if we said, well, look, you know what? If we ship that food from northern Italy, and of course we don't have to go that far, we can provide that food ourselves, and you can eat whatever you want. You can eat as much cream and cheese and pasta as you want, but it's all going to be, I will say, grown in a real organic manner, and it's going to be with no artificial flavorings whatsoever. You think that their system would find balance?
That's a great question. I mean, and that's a question we should be looking at scientifically, because I have my opinion, and I think the answer is yes, but we should be testing this scientifically. But there's the other problem that when you get to a level of obesity, that's a hard problem to fix. Far better that we never get there in the first place. You know, we're finding with these new GLP-1 based drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro and so forth, they say that once you come off the drugs, the weight comes back. Maybe there's some cases where it doesn't, but what that tells you is once you get to that level, it's hard to deal with. I think far better that we never get there in the first place. And I think you're far less likely, as we see in Italy or Japan, to have these problems with obesity when you have a more honest food system.
Yeah. You came to our book club with Dan Barber.
Yeah.
That was great, right? And we had a great book club with Mark also. I really enjoyed it. Great conversations. And you had a question for Dan, in which he was so pleased to see you there. Do you remember the question? Do you remember his answer?
I think it was something like, you know, if you think of these two kind of tracks you can be on, sort of the junk food track or the real food track, is there a food that's like a transformative food that can get you into the better lane? I think it was something like that.
Yeah, because because we're so confused.
Yeah.
Our senses are hijacked.
Yeah.
And once your senses are confused and hijacked, I know this, you know, you say, no, all you have to do, and Dan says this, all you have to do is, you know, deliciousness will save us. And I go, yeah, well, people think Doritos are delicious. I mean, you can say, well, they aren't really, and I understand what you mean, but it's confusing. We are confused. So how do we get to a place of less confusion where we can taste the difference between good, delicious nourishment and stuff that's actually bad for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I use the example of dark chocolate because there was a woman I met and she had a binge eating disorder. And she said dark chocolate helped her. She said at first she didn't like it. It was bitter. But then she kind of liked it, and then she liked it more. But she said the thing about dark chocolate is you can't binge eat it. You can't eat it quickly. It sort of forces you to slow down. And now she loves it. And then when she puts milk chocolate in her mouth, she's like, oh my God, this is like way too sweet. So I think, you know, the palate changes. I mean, part of it is that we're all teenagers, and teenagers really do need a lot of energy. They're growing. Their metabolisms are a lot more faster than my metabolism would be. I think part of our problem is we never stop being teenagers. We never stop eating the kids' menu of hot dogs and, you know, chicken fingers and stuff like that, or pizza, crappy pizza. But your palate can change. There was a time in my life I never would have contemplated eating arugula. I love it now. Yeah. And you never feed for a child's 7th birthday party what you might serve at my 50th birthday party, because the palate changes as the needs of the body change. I saw recently there was this guy on Twitter saying how, you know, children are so much more in kind of the grasp of reinforcing palatable foods, because he's talking about how his kids just want to eat dessert. And to some degree that's true, but we got to remember kids also, they're growing. They sprint everywhere. There's a reason kids like sugar, because their bodies are different. There's a reason kids don't like vegetables, because vegetables are filled with what can be toxic compounds. So one of the reasons we don't want moms to smoke or pregnant women is because growing bodies are much more sensitive to plant toxic compounds than grown bodies, where those compounds, like bitter compounds, can be good for you. So I think there's a wisdom in all of our dietary preferences. It's just a question of whether the food matches that wisdom.
I want to go there, but let's finish with Dan. Do you remember what Dan's answer was to your
I
question?
think, was it sourdough bread?
Bread.
Yeah, bread.
One word.
Good bread, though. Real bread.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, because we know that most bread isn't going to be that gateway, that exit ramp.
I've had Dan's bread. I think I could just live on that. I'd be happy.
I agree. It's fantastic. I mean, it's truly memorable.
Yeah.
It creates a great pleasure, and some craving. I will say, last time I went down to see Dan, my wife, on the way out, she said, "Make sure you bring back some of that bread."
That's definitely.
Yeah. So I thought, what an interesting answer, though. Bread, such a simple, basic food. It used to be the staple of Europe, right? People got most of their calories from bread.
Yeah.
Now, it's not just bread that's well made, it's bread that's well grown.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes into it.
There's a lot that goes into it. I've had the whole wheat bialys out of his kitchen. They're just amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
You should have catered this conversation. Get Dan to cater it. That would have been something.
I know. Well, anybody that gets a chance, they have a nice little cafe that is not super expensive. You can go and get some astonishingly good food there at Stone Barns. So let's talk about money just for a minute here. And let's talk about power. How is this perpetuated? I mean, I don't believe that this system is being driven by philanthropy. I don't think that this is being driven by people who are going, what can we do to make people healthier and happier in life? I think it's being driven by profit.
Yeah. If we look at something like Enrichment, I think that was well intended. Yes. I think to this day, there's a lot of people who think Rice Krispies with vitamins are more healthy than Rice Krispies without. I don't. I think that's actually wrong. I think you're better off giving your kids the Rice Krispies without, because then if they're not getting the vitamins there, they will start to crave them and want them in other foods. That's my belief. So I think that was well intended. I think if you look at, the guy who invented Doritos was named Arch West. I think he was a good person. I think maybe in later parts of his life he may have realized the monster he'd created. But the food companies, I've met people, they're not pure evil people. A lot of them have masters and PhDs. They're quite smart. They think food is a personal choice. I think it's deeper than that. When Starbucks puts vitamins in its energy drink, I don't know why they do that. Do they think people will think it's healthy? I see my kids getting them, and I think sometimes they really think if you put vitamins in, people will think it's healthier because it's got vitamins. This is all a profit-driven system, that's true. But the system in Italy is also profit-driven. I mean, the people selling San Marzano tomatoes are making a good living. Those people making that pasta in Bologna are not doing it for free. They're not philanthropists. I'm not saying they're crazed, greedy billionaire capitalists, but they make money too. So I think the system can work. I don't think it's capitalism that's gone amok. I think it's our culture, in the sense that we don't. It comes down to that decision to fortify versus to give poor people access to better food. It's the way we honor food and what we believe about it. I think the way we talk about these cell-based meats and plant-based meats, if you want to eat them, go ahead. But the fact that people just said there was like a standing ovation, they just assumed this is much better, because we always think technology, science is going to get us out of this. And maybe one day it will, but I think nature is far more complex than we're capable of understanding. So I'm with nature at this point.
Yeah. It's very well said. I have a friend who gives me the food as a personal choice argument. And, basically it's a conservative perspective of don't tell me what to eat and don't tell anyone else what to eat. And I say, if you think no one's telling you what to eat, you're sadly mistaken, because you are being told. You're just not understanding the persuasion that's going on.
Well, but put this back to your friend then. Why is it that enrichment is the law in, I think, more than half the states, such that most major flour millers do it because they don't want to have to say, I can't sell my flour in this state? A conservative would rail against that. The government telling you,
right. Right. And many other ways. We know the hidden persuaders. We know the the power of marketing is enormous. And I don't know, it's an interesting question about personal choice. When you talk about, well, they're not evil people, I agree. I know lots of people who work in those worlds and they're not personally evil, but the system seems to be enormously destructive. And the question is not how do we find people and say, you're bad, but how do we change this?
Yeah.
How do we create a system that is more beneficial for all of us?
No, and it gets back to this issue of complexity, because even when I talk about enrichment, I'm not against. I think maybe iodine and salt probably is a good idea, and maybe folate isn't a bad idea. Which is just to say these things are so complex. But I think, how do you change these? I wish I had like a 10-word answer that really nailed it, and I don't know if I do. But what I will say is there is evidence of positive change. Like, it sounds as though everything's constantly getting worse. But the examples I often talk about are craft beer. If you got in a time machine, I use this example all the time. If you got a time machine, went back to like 1988 and got a bunch of beer executives together. And this is when people drank, I think it was Miller Lite, Bud Light, and Michelob Light. And they tasted exactly the same, to the point that a loyal Bud Light drinker could not tell the difference between Bud Light and Michelob Light and Miller Lite. They would do tests. It all came down to like advertising and girls in bikinis and guys in hot rods and stuff. If you said to them, in several decades, the beer market will be dominated by IPAs and dudes with beards who drink, beer like insanely bitter beer, and that these craft beers will have something like half the market, and that there will be major marketing crises for brands like Bud Light. They would just say, "You're insane. That'll never happen." And that's the world we live in. Why do craft beer drinkers drink craft beer? It's not because someone told them it's healthy. Maybe it started because it's cool, but they like it. It's driven by flavor. And they have an awareness of the different kinds of beer. They have an awareness of the different kinds of hops, the different ingredients, the different traditions of beer making. Some of them make beer themselves. This, leads into things like making their own bread. They get interested in yeast. I think the chocolate palette has improved, that there's some brands of really dark chocolate that have gotten really popular. I think the wine palette has improved. I think there's better cheese around. That's not to say it's all. It's to say that we can worship at the throne of flavor, and it takes us to a good place. I just think we kind of have to expand it.
That's a remarkably radical statement that we should worship at the throne of flavor and
real flavor.
And real flavor. And let me add something you said to me earlier, that flavor is the ambassador of nutrition.
Yeah.
And not that we have to think about nutrition, that if we take away all the flavorings and everything, flavor will lead us it will lead us to the right place.
Yes, I think that's true.
All right. Any last words of something? There's so much more we have already talked about and could talk about, but it's late and it's time for us to go make an Alder Spring steak. But is there anything else you'd like to add, Mark?
I think we covered a lot. Something will occur to me, and it'll be, at 2 a.m. when I wake up and I go, oh, I should.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.
It's great to be here.
Wonderful conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.